Our next session, you probably know that through a Washington State proviso, there's a 2-biennium effort to collect sidewalk and crossing data for the entire state of Washington. And this is a first ever attempt at standardizing data in that way to enable measuring and managing infrastructure at a state level. And I'm super excited to present to you our panel today, which will speak to that effort. We have partners here from the Tasker Center, Tanisha, who bridges our work with the community through the Empower Movement Washington, Disability Rights Washington, and the Tasker Center. And we have a number of representatives from Washington State DOT who've been an amazing partner to both the effort to get this off the ground, as well as the effort to machinate it and make it happen. And I'm sure they will be amazing partners in actually operationalizing this data to ensure that we have sustainable and translatable use of these data. So it's not just a collect and dump, but actually persists and enables us to share and continue and manage our infrastructure in a better, more data-driven way. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So, of course, we're focused on personalized, accessible trip planning, but that was just how we got into this business. And as you see here today, there are many folks in the room who come from a number of different causes, as well as efforts towards understanding active transportation better, multimodal transportation efforts, and other ways of attending to the needs of different types of users that are not just riders of private vehicles or the scheduled fixed route system. So I wanted to jazz things up first by showing you a video that was co-produced with Tanisha Amara and Paulo Nunez Ngueno, who's been a huge supporter of our effort here. Sidewalks connect us to everything. Essential services, to grocery stores, to our workplaces and health options.
And everybody uses sidewalks, whether you're walking, rolling, driving, getting to transit. We all depend on sidewalks to get to where we need to go safely.
1 in 4 Americans face transportation barriers that leave them disconnected. Unlike the road network, we just don't have data about where sidewalks are failing people, where they're disconnected, or are in poor condition.
That's why Washington became the first state to invest in a statewide pedestrian data set.
OS Connect accounts for all the sidewalks and crossings in Washington State, where they are, what condition they're in, and how they are connected.
OS Connect data feeds into 2 powerful applications. For travelers, Access Map is a personalized pedestrian wayfinding tool. Walksheds helps planners visualize real accessibility in their streets.
Access Map provides some information that others don't. For instance, it gives me cues about non-visual landmarks such as benches, bollards, street poles that I will encounter.
Slide right and cross the street. Surface, concrete.
I put in my power wheelchair preference, and it routes me to where I need to go according to my mobility needs.
We use cutting-edge AI, computational work, and digital discourse tools to engage communities in that conversation and crowdsource the data. And we result in the most comprehensive, detailed, vetted, statewide data set for sidewalks and crossings.
OS Connect helps me get around safely, and it also empowers cities and agencies to improve pedestrian access for everyone.
Using Access Map lets me get a better idea of the route that I'm going to be planning and giving to the people currently taking access. It lets me look for barriers like incline, curb cuts, things that would end a trip. It lets me see those things ahead of time and know what I'm looking for in the field.
Good data makes it easy for planners and designers to do their work and with greater focus on the details that make or break pedestrian infrastructure. It can help them spot safety and quality of life issues so that they can be addressed more quickly and systematically. Today, WashDOT's roadway focused because we have to be. The roads are the only part of the network we have a complete view of. Adding sidewalk data will allow us to rethink the network from the ground up. The pedestrian infrastructure will be part of the core network that we'll see every time we look at a map.
Washington is absolutely leading the nation in understanding safety and how it connects to pedestrian infrastructure. And also it is leading the nation in trying to identify computational and innovative technical ways to address these challenges.
We're asking for support to complete our sidewalk mapping data project in order to make this data real change on the ground.
If we don't get this funding, Washington State loses momentum that it's gained in creating walkable, sustainable communities that are safe for everyone.
My hope is that Access Map would be available everywhere, just how Google Maps is available.
It's such an important tool in order for people to get around, and especially now with housing issues, to be able to plan ahead neighborhoods and being able to see if there's going to be hills that are too steep or inaccessible sidewalks. Hopefully we can connect all of our sidewalks.
Now we need legislative support to continue the effort in order to improve the data and also allow people to use it downstream in an active, usable way. So, on our panel today is Thomas Craig, who was just featured, Mary DeBose, Grace Young, Tanisha Sepulveda, and Lacey Hampton, and myself, Anat Caspi. And what we wanted to talk about today was basically what is this project scope, but also what led to this, and how do we make sure that we actually maintain this amazing resource that the state has put us to. So a little bit about the scope itself. We, through our advisory work, I think there was a presenter review where I don't need to crane my head around. Maybe I'll just speak to it. So we worked with our advisory committee in several meetings to really understand how do we probe the vast amount of satellite state imagery that exists, and what is the project scope for this, for the first biennium specifically. And the agreement was that we're looking at population centers, focusing on 95% of the state's population, which basically came out to about 6,100 square kilometers of area. And in addition to that, we wanted to address some of the unincorporated areas in the state, but we couldn't analyze the imagery for all of them. And so the decision was made to focus on the areas that are most populated in unincorporated areas, as well as transit stops. We'll hear in a minute how this whole effort came to be, and it was through the Washington State DOT's effort to understand access to frequent transit in the state. And so there was a high focus on enabling this data to connect us to transit. Therefore, the addition of unincorporated transit stops was made. And so that was the project scope. As far as making sure that the data was standardized and complete, that was a big focus. So we're going big on completeness of the data, meaning we will have all the tags being the same across the state, but we may not have super deep, detailed tags for every place. So we're going on high impact, very high validation on the data, but maybe not too deep in the initial state. The other part that was really important is to produce a transportation graph. This means that there's a layer of data that enables us to really assess on the ground connectivity. So that means how are people connecting from their homes, places of work, to different services, both transportation services and otherwise. And so producing that graph layer is really the initial step. and then providing the technical stack that allows us to add data as we go with specific use cases in mind. So we might not go super deep with the type of data that's available there. What we see here is exactly what's collected for the entire state. What you see are 3 different entity types of lines, basically. Why are we representing sidewalks as lines? Well, that has to do with that routability, the ability to use routers to direct us who's connected and how are they connected. We have 3 different types of entities of lines. We have sidewalks, we have crossings, and we have those links that connect the sidewalks to the crossings. And then as far as the attributes that are connected there, I wish I could see the screen myself, but you can all read it. From memory, we have width, incline, surface type, as well as obviously the locations of these things. So when we started this work in 2015, we got a data set from Seattle DOT, and there was difficulty in assessing sometimes where some of those lines were. Even though there was high effort to provide the GPS locations of the sidewalks, they weren't necessarily placed in the right location. And so having the accuracy that's associated with where these lines are and how they are connected is actually not a simple challenge. And really that's what our productizing of the machine learning part of this enable us to do at scale and extensively. So the data standard that we use is called Open Sidewalks. You may have heard of it before. This is a data schema, really, that we've created in-house. It's very similar to a number of other schemas that are out there. We're trying to coalesce across the nation through an effort through the Bureau of Transportation Statistics to create a standardized national pedestrian and bike data schema. And if you're interested, please let me know, because that effort is ongoing. There's another basically year in the effort, and what we're hoping to do is get outreach to different organizations within states so that we can actually functionalize these data across different institutions. Being able to standardize this across the nation means that everybody can use the same downstream tools that enable folks to do the right types of analyses, whether they be around walk sheds or bike sheds, as well as enable downstream consumption of this for different types of transportation applications and mobility applications. And we'll talk about all of that this afternoon in terms of like how well can we scale these data across different places in the nation and regions so that we're able to have similar apps available to everybody, so that both planners have the access to the data to do whatever they do typically, but also be working with certain workflows that are standardized across the nation so that we can make comparative assessments of, two communities, how well are things accessible there using the same metrics, which is not currently possible. So using the Open Sidewalks data schema allows us to have efficient methods for both collecting the data and using it downstream. And then using an open shared data infrastructure that we have built through the help of US DOT recently means that we have standardized APIs that allow downstream developers to consume that data at scale currently across the whole state, but hopefully in the future across many other states as well. And so what we are trying to address here is really attending to sustainability and scalability with an effort to not waste this one-time opportunity that the state had given us in doing the collection, but not being able to sustain it over time. And so the reason we have folks here in the room is how to coalesce and partner to support that effort across the board, both in the inception of the data, but then how do we allow small communities as well as large community stakeholders to use the data ongoing, because use essentially drives continued maintenance. You won't have any data stewardship if you don't have active users that really have an interest in having that data constantly updated and current. So a little bit about how the data was collected. I can tell that I'm a little bit over time, so I'll just rush through it. We have our production partners in Gaussian Solutions who took the machine learning efforts that we developed here in-house at the University of Washington and really made it possible for us to extend this to the 6,400 square kilometers across the state. The effort there is enabled by the Washington State Imagery Consortium. The consortium was one that had already pre-purchased the satellite imagery, and that really made it possible for us to start the work and scale it to the entire state rather quickly. If it had not been there, the original plan was to use Bing Imagery, who had changed their license just as we were beginning the work. Previous to the 2023 biennium kickoff, Bing was allowing the use of derivative data from their imagery to be open and shared, and they had made the decision to close it off. So, for those not in the room, but on Zoom listening to this and thinking like, how can I get this across my state? There is this dependency on having large scale data that is of high enough resolution across the entire state. And so that's a first step to really think about. Next, we really thought about how do we validate and vet this data. As you know, a lot of times people introduce accuracy metrics to machine learning efforts, but many a times that requires a validation set. So when you hear terms like sensitivity, specificity, or recall, there's a dependency there on having already valid data that we call gold truths in order to assess like how true were our predictions via these models. And as we all know, the data that we came in with was rather scant, not standardized, difficult to assess. And therefore, we needed to come up with another mechanism to do this for the whole state in a quick way that allowed us to do human validation fairly quickly. And so the types of tools that we produced, I won't show them to you right now, but it was built on top of the OpenStreetMap stack, but allowed our vetters to do pretty quick validation for every single sidewalk and crossing that is in this data set. And so there have been human eyes on this data that we're introducing you to. Does that mean it's absolutely perfect? No, but you can certainly understand that now that we do have this gold truth, we can better assess these algorithms so that in the future, when we republish the data based on new satellite imagery, we can be much better assured that our algorithms are much better. So this idea of like, we'll redo this again and we keep that in mind is really a driving force behind how we operate. Our vetters, so at least one pair of eyes was put on these data, but we also sample statistically some of the data in order to have second vetters to assess how are we doing even with our vetted work. And that too took place for these data. What I can tell you right now, so rather than numbers, it's really about the original machine learning algorithms were obviously trained on data that we did have, and often that data is very much dense urban focused, and so we perform much better in dense urban areas. Those areas that typically are rural, suburban, might be a little bit more dodgy as far as the data, the initial predictions were. But as I said, everything was vetted via human eyes, and so data that was missed was added back in. And all data sets that pass that QA are then released via the TDI viewer. And so we have QR codes for all of you who want to kind of track our progress. We have a dashboard online that you're able to hop onto and see where we are, and also be able to download the data where you need it. So, an activity outside is also regarding Access Map. So for those of you who might want to access this information via a router to be able to personalize the routes that you get using that more accurate data than what some of the mass-produced apps might have. So we would love to have your opinions in terms of which jurisdictions you want to be able to see on Access Map. I will just go straight to the impact. I won't describe the quality metrics. We do have, we've suggested new quality metrics to be able to assess this data, because really this data has not been available before. Even when machine learning algorithms have been used in the past to predict where sidewalks are, they were not necessarily connected graph networks. And one of the most important functionality of this, this asset that we've built is its connectivity. So being able to actually assess what is that experience on the ground of traversing these infrastructure or these built environments is really important, but there was not that work or scoring methodology before. So thanks to our advisor in Bill Howe, we developed a method that was recently shown at TRB. I will pass it on to Tanisha to talk a little bit about how we are working with communities now in order to get some eyes on the ground to assess how well this data reflects what's there. Do you have a?
Can you hear me? Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Anat. Yes, so as far as impact on the ground and advocacy, as you heard even earlier mentioned by Armand in his session, where advocacy is extremely important in these roles in getting communities connected and able to use this data and use the data to empower their communities in order to, bring these numbers to legislators, policymakers, decision makers, in order to show where, the fixes are needed, where the maintenance is needed. Because there's nobody who knows their community better than the people who live there and move around there every single day. And oftentimes when you see people, who aren't familiar with these areas brought in to do, the scope and look around, they're missing these intricate areas where, people who live in these communities, they know and they operate and they understand where sidewalks are broken and things are not connected to the resources that they're trying to get to. So by going out into communities and talking to these different people, we're able to get a better understanding of how people are connected to the resources, how they move around, and figure out what's needed in order to improve. So in some instances, like the tools that we're using that you'll hear more about later, such as Access Map, GoInfo Games, has been really intricate in allowing people to not only assess, but put in the information into these tools that show where, maintenance needs to be done, there needs to be more connectivity, and then it allows them to, basically quantify this information and bring it to bigger decision makers and policy makers in order to get these changes made. It also allows, It also allows for communities and cities to help adopt other efforts. So one thing that we were involved in and have are our SCLEOs, which are specialized community-led impact opportunities, one of which we've worked with King County Metro and their Health Through Housing program, and going out to areas of different transitional housing and seeing, basically 10-minute walk sheds where, what resources do these people have? we're basically putting people out into these more industrial type areas, you know, and these people are trying to just get back on their feet, make better lives for themselves. But when they're not connected to their community, when they're surrounded by businesses that are of no use to them, it really doesn't help in these situations. So what our tools allow and what OS Connect data allows is for us to better understand from the people who live in these areas, you know, what their needs are, and to show how important it is in order to access these resources. And it also makes sure, you know, for a public participation. So we're allowing communities to also be involved in our data collection and really getting a voice to speak to what their needs are personally. And overall, these community-led sidewalk mapping projects really empower the public to contribute the data, to validate the data as we're going around and making sure, as Anat was saying, that human eyes are on this information, that we are getting, you know, real-time, up-to-date access to what's going on the ground. Because when we use like satellite imagery and you know, the images that are on Google Maps and everything, not everything is up to date. So this allows for everything to be a sustainable way of keeping things up to date and at your fingertips when you need it. And that, yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
So we will. And Lacey Hampton is here to represent when we have Q&A, one of our specialized community-led impact opportunities, where she came out of Seattle Public Schools looking for opportunities to better map our parks to connect students, to, specifically students with accessibility concerns, to the sidewalk infrastructure. I'm going to flip to your presentation.
Thank you, Anat. Thank you, Taskar team, for running this awesome event. I'm Thomas Craig. I am a transportation planner at the Washington State Department of Transportation. I'm going to leave it to my coworkers, Grace and Mary, to kind of talk practically in a bit about really what WashDOT is thinking about how to use this data, how to build it into our workflows. I'm going to send us off a little bit into a pipe dream, maybe a provocation a bit, about thinking big of what potentially this type of data could mean for statewide planning, for statewide decision making, if it were really kind of incorporated into a broader ecosystem of interoperable analysis that we've already started to build, but that we have a really long way to go still in order to really see the full fruits of. So I want to start with the Washington State Transportation Policy Goals. These are encoded in state law. This is RCW up on the screen. I won't read it all. But basically, we have 6 statewide transportation policy goals that the purpose of all statewide transportation spending is ultimately to promote preservation, safety, stewardship, mobility, economic vitality, and the environment. And specifically, there's a priority set for the policies of policy goals of preservation and safety. So we, WashDOT, myself and the Public Transportation Division and WashDOT as a whole, we publish performance metrics. PTD, the Public Transportation Division, publishes, just like the federal government, stats on public transportation hours, miles, ridership, unlinked trips. What's an unlinked trip? I don't know. I do know, but who really knows? And of course, other WashDOT divisions publish data on crashes, road miles, user counts, and system costs. But those metrics really only say so much. Have a screenshot here from WashDOT's Gray Notebook, an awesome resource that publishes a lot of good data. I've dropped down one menu to show some active transportation data indicating the rise in deaths of pedestrians and bicyclists in traffic crashes over the last few years. That's startling data. It certainly means something. There's certainly lessons we can draw from it. But it's not necessarily operationally useful in some of the most important decisions that hypothetically a Department of Transportation has to be making. It doesn't really help us ask the question, based on our goals, should we spend money on A or B? Really, that's, like in theory, the type of question we should be able to use data to answer rigorously and effectively. So I want to propose basically that access is the point of transportation and something that we can quantitatively measure in order to answer precisely those types of questions. Trips take place with an origin, a destination, and a path in between. That's how transportation operates. And access is something that we can quantify and describe in a way that is really meaningful to lived experiences. We can talk about access and we can say that someone who can get to 1,000 jobs in 30 minutes has more access to jobs than someone who can get to 10 jobs in 30 minutes. That's both true and also means something. We could imagine, like, okay, if I live in a place where suddenly I only have access to 10 jobs within a 30-minute commute, if that's the highest, longest commute that I want to take, well, there's only 10 places total I can apply. And if I have certain salary requirements and a certain industry that I want to work in, maybe I don't even have access to any jobs I can actually work at. Access can be a performance metric. And I want to propose that access can be in line with all 6 of our statewide policy goals. Access is a proxy for mobility and economy. It's directly related. More access means more mobility. Every access point to opportunity is an opportunity to spend money that drives the economy. Access can be used to calculate which investments are going to yield more safety and environmental benefits. That's because we know that safety and environmental benefits of transportation is primarily related to the mode that's being used for transportation. And if we can show that we're increasing access to certain modes that are safer and more environmentally friendly, then we can project that we're going to have a safer and more environmentally friendly transportation system. And finally, access can be calculated with a project benefit per unit of cost. And cost, of course, is really what stewardship and preservation is all about, because if we have the ability, if we have money to spend in the future, we can preserve, we can steward our transportation system. If we don't have money available, we can't. So access to opportunities is one particular type of quantitative approach to measuring access. We see here on the screen a screenshot from an application that we use internally at WashDOT in order to measure access to opportunities. We have a blue dot in the top left of the image that indicates an origin location. We have, you can kind of barely see it, sorry about the colors, but a smaller blue isochrone that covers about half of the area of a larger red isochrone. We have a series of black dots that are each jobs. And we can use software and data sources available to us to measure actual trips from that origin to each individual spot within this area that we're looking at. And we can measure the difference between the blue isochrone and the red isochrone, which is the difference between the current Yakima Transit network and the Yakima Transit network if all of those routes were running on a 15-minute headway instead of the slower 30-minute headway that they're running on today. And we can go and count up all of the dots that are accessible within a 30-minute commute from that origin location. So we can see that we increase access without speeding up transit, just by increasing the frequency of transit. We're able to provide access to that point of more than twice as many jobs, moving from 8,500 up to 18,500, just by increasing the frequency of that transit service network. And we can both see that and count up all those jobs. Then we can go and compile into a geographical polygon the results from each individual location within that Yakima area. And we can make a geographical file where we can basically say, okay, in these darker blue areas in the isochrone that I'm showing on the screen now, there's more access to jobs, up to a high end of 40,000 jobs from some of those points. And in areas with lighter blue or no blue, there's less access to jobs. So this is kind of crunching those isochrones that we saw on the last screen into a count at each physical location within the Yakima service area. And turning that transportation data into geographical data means that we can start to mix with other data sources, like, for example, the Environmental Health Disparities Map, which is, per the HEAL Act, the Healthy Environments for All Act in Washington State, a proposed or a data source that we're meant to use for environmental justice analysis. And we can start to cross-cut these different geographical data sets together. So here's my core proposal. We can fix all issues with transportation in 4 easy steps. We establish a process to define the access score of a project, incorporating safety, environment, and economic goals into that calculation process. For every possible investment, we calculate an access score and a project cost, and then we pursue the projects with the highest access to cost ratios. Step 4 is we coordinate with land use and work diligently with communities for 20 to 100 years. So, you know, it gets difficult, but the beginning of this workflow does a lot of the work for us, and it's a foundation that we don't have today, but we're building it. Public Transportation Division is developing this system to enable a multimodal analysis. So we can do this now across all modes statewide, in large part thanks to the great work of UW and this OS Connect project. We've collected that sidewalk data, but also other types of data. We spent the last few years collecting transit service data in GTFS and GTFS Flex, improving our roadway data as well as the sidewalk data, identifying the right demographic and land use data sets, as well as open destination data sets to start thinking about those places that people want to travel to. And we can calculate those types of metrics of access statewide for all modes. And we're already doing this to a degree. Last summer, the Public Transportation Division was asked by the Legislative Office a question from a state legislator: how many jobs are accessible by transit in Washington State? We didn't think that that question was quite precisely well-formed enough, and we kind of reframed the question a little bit when we answered, and ultimately produced a report using these analyses that found that statewide, the average transit rider has access to about 7% of the jobs that are accessible to a driver of a personal vehicle within a 45-minute commute. So if one of you drives to work today, if you lose your car tomorrow, 93% of your access disappeared. That's messed up. That's inequitable. But that's what real trips show about the difference right now between the driving network and the transit network. Using those same methodologies, later last year after we wrote that report, an intern that came into the Public Transportation Division was able to produce a report looking at local parks access using these same methodologies, no specialist training in transportation, just using some of the documentation and processes that we have in-house. And that intern produced a report that found that today, 1/3 of Washingtonians have easy access to more local parks because of public transportation. Of that 1/3 of Washingtonians that has more access to parks through transit, the average gain is about 75% more park acreage within a 15-minute trip. So transit today, even though it's not providing nearly as much access as the roadway network and the ability to have a single occupancy vehicle, is providing a really huge benefit to the public and allowing people to have more easy access to parks today. We're now looking at the public transportation plan that we plan to put out mid next year, a new version, and we're building our advisory groups now. And we're thinking about access to opportunities as a quantitative framework to build into our public transportation plan. But what does that really mean to have a quantitative framework for your public transportation plan? So here's one option. And it kind of follows from the model that we used in the WashDOT Frequent Transit Service study that Dr. Caspi mentioned earlier. We benchmark access. We project how much access is our goal, and then we identify a cost and a timeline to reach that goal. We're going to do this with the public transportation plan, and I wonder why we stopped there. Let's do this with all modes. Let's think about this for the Washington Transportation Plan. Let's think about this in order to think statewide. What are our mobility goals? How are we going to get there? What is it going to cost? What modes are we going to need support? And how much funding are they going to need in order to accomplish that? So a new, maybe not really new, because I'll be honest, none of this is original. This is built on methodologies that have been around for decades. The technology is getting newer. The data sets are coming around and allowing us to do more. But this really isn't a terribly new version of thinking about transportation management. And I think if we were to recreate from the ground up transportation management today, we'd probably do more or less this. But we're not recreating transportation today. There's history. DOT started as highway building organizations decades ago. That's weight we carry with us. But hypothetically, in 2032, maybe WashDOT calculates the access score for every transportation project under consideration. And maybe we weight scores for state priorities, including environmental justice and including community feedback that we collect. And maybe we present a table something like this. On the screen is a matrix of 6 different columns and 5 different rows, including the headers, a number of projects, their cost, their economic benefit, their access per dollar, the number of deaths that we would expect from the transportation system per dollar, and the community desire. And maybe we can look at widening I-5 again, and maybe it's going to cost us $10 billion, but it's only going to provide us $5 billion in economic benefit. We're going to get a very marginal amount of increased access to destinations, and we're going to kill some people. Alternatively, we could build sidewalks everywhere. It's going to cost the same. We're going to have 5 times as much economic benefit. We're going to have 15 times as much increased access based on our weighting. We're going to save lives instead of kill them. And the community also likes it. Maybe there's other things that we can do, and we can calculate these types of metrics for any type of project. I think maybe we would make different decisions if we were looking at this table before we decided where to put billions of dollars. We'll find out. Thank you.
So my name is Mary DeBose, and I work for WashDOT as the Roadside Asset Data Steward. And with me is Grace Young. Do you want to? Sure.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Young. I am the GIS and Data Specialist in the Active Transportation Division at WashDOT.
And today we're going to dive into a little bit more of the specifics on sidewalk data stewardship and speak from WashDOT perspective on our priorities and pathways for using and maintaining active transportation data. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go into the past, present, and future of sidewalk data in Washington from WashDOT's perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we see in stewarding this non-centralized data set. And we'll speak a little bit about a initiative with UW and us to support pedestrian data usage and learn a little bit more about it within our agency. So the past, so sidewalk data pre-2023. We had a setup where agencies maintained their own sidewalk data sets, each having their own attributes, their own frequency of updates, different methods of collection. Some areas had overlapping data, some areas were missing data. It was just kind of a hodgepodge, and each depending on the different needs and functions and abilities and funding of each agency. At WashDOT, we are responsible for the sidewalk data along state routes. So that's what we collect and maintain. Here on the screen, there's 3 images of 3 different sidewalk data sets, each kind of zoomed into the same area of Seattle. The one on the left is the WashDOT data for sidewalks along state routes. Then in the middle, there's sidewalks maintained by King County Roads Division. And then on the right side, there's City of Seattle sidewalks. So each of these three, some have overlapping areas of concern, some are completely different. So you can kind of see how there's inconsistencies and kind of just weird stuff in the gaps and overlaps. If you think about North 145th Street, it kind of forms that border between Seattle and Shoreline. It's also known as State Route 523, so we care about it on the state level. If you think about any given intersection along this street, you may have sidewalk data or curb ramp data or crosswalk data right there that we care about, that Seattle cares about, Shoreline cares about it too, and King County. And any of those lines and points that make up that data may not connect, and they probably don't share the same attributes. So I know some of these data sets collect really valuable information like sidewalk width or maybe even incline. Our data set at WashDOT, we don't have that. We have not had the resources in the past to collect that level of data for our sidewalks. It only says there's a sidewalk here or there is not a sidewalk here. So it's a little bit different. So going into where we are now, we've heard about the sidewalk data proviso. That's for the 2023 to 2025 biennium. And that has been focused on producing this sidewalk data as well as working on the mechanisms to deliver it and to vet the data, as we've heard about so far. And running along parallel to this effort, separately from it, but in response to it, is an internal research project that we're doing in collaboration with the University of Washington. And the goal of this project is to understand how we currently use sidewalk data within our agency and how we'd like to use it in the future. And kind of a more broad goal of this project is that there's been such a significant effort and funding and work put into this creation of the sidewalk data set. So we want to treat that with the care it deserves and really think carefully about ways to steward the data going forward and to enable the people that need it for their work to support the mission of WashDOT to be able to use it and to be able to get what they need from it. So right now, we have been using the sidewalk data that tells us if there's a sidewalk there or not. The data is available internally to WashDOT staff, but it's also available to the public. We have been using it internally for a few different analyses and different procedures. One example is if you are a project engineer and you're going to scope a new project and you need to know, should I put some funds in here for building new sidewalk, or is the sidewalk already there? So just kind of at that base level, identifying the gaps in the sidewalk network to know where to direct those resources. A second topic or reason that we use the data is tracking investment that we've made in sidewalk and curb ramp improvements. And this goes, that data goes into our ADA transition plan, which is required to be produced every year. And we do track that data of how much money did we spend to build sidewalks last fiscal year. So again, that's kind of a very basic level of analysis, and there's a lot more that we could do with data. And I'll turn it over to Grace to talk about that.
Yeah, I get to talk about the fun part, which is the dreaming of the future and what we can do with this incredible new data set. Some ways that we would like to use this sidewalk data in the future. Obviously, this is a non-exhaustive list. We heard a great impassioned cry from Thomas for how that could really change things. I'll touch on a few things. So I'm in the active transportation division, and we use a measure called level of traffic stress, which indicates how comfortable you feel walking or biking. We also do this for bicycling along a roadway segment. It has to do with things like characteristics about the pedestrian environment, like how wide is the sidewalk, how wide is the buffer width between the sidewalk and the road, but also roadway characteristics like the number of lanes, the traffic speed, and the traffic volume. And currently with our data, we only know if there's a sidewalk there or not. And we all know that walking on a sidewalk that's 4 feet wide next to a 4-lane road is really uncomfortable. But if that sidewalk is 8 feet wide and there's a 6-foot buffer, maybe you have a really different experience. But we can't explain or we can't describe those conditions in a statewide scale right now because we lack the data to do so. And our hope is that this data set in the future will enable us to do a more robust analysis in the state. This ties into our Complete Streets goals. Complete Streets is a program or a requirement that all state transportation projects over a certain dollar amount in population centers are required to meet a level of traffic stress 2 or better, which if you're familiar with the all ages and abilities language, this is LTS 1 typically corresponds with all ages and abilities, and we like to say LTS 2 is most ages and abilities. So obviously we strive for LTS 1, but LTS 2 is the standard for population centers. The next bullet point I have up here is project or grant prioritization. This sort of ties into what Thomas was talking about. In the WSDOT sense, could we use this data to measure access gain for our own WSDOT projects and then use that information to prioritize where we're spending our money? But also, for example, in the Active Transportation Division, we administer 3 different grant programs. And now that we'll have data at the statewide scale that's consistent, we would be able to evaluate grant proposals across the state using the same metric of access gain, which is really exciting. The next bullet point, safety, performance, and collision analysis. This is something that Mary's team works on. Understanding what's the pedestrian environment like in areas where pedestrian collisions are happening can help us, research what conditions provide more comfortable, safer conditions, and where what the characteristics are of places where these collisions are happening. And then finally, related to Thomas's work, this transit accessibility analysis. We know pretty much every transit trip starts with a walk, and so in order to access those transit stops, you need sidewalks to get there. Let's see, what do we have next? Oh, good. Okay, so Mary introduced the internal research project, which is one that we're running in parallel with the proviso. This is a research project that we are reviewing essentially how WSDOT uses sidewalk data and how we can incorporate this new data set into our existing workflows. WSDOT is a longstanding institution with a lot of institutional knowledge and a lot of processes that are very baked in because we've existed for a long time and people have been doing things one way for a long time. So we're identifying, we have this great new data set and trying to understand how we can actually use it in our work. We're kind of describing this as a business plan for the sidewalk data. How can we get people to adopt it? And then also, how can we be good stewards of the data? Because like my colleagues have said, if we don't keep it up to date, then it becomes useless very quickly. So these are some, as we were conducting this research analysis, we had some questions in the beginning, and then we interviewed colleagues across the agency, and from project engineers all the way up to big decision makers, to sort of wrap our heads around how decisions are made, how people use data. And these are some technical questions that honestly I think of these as like the easy to solve questions because we work with such a great technical team, but they are real problems that we'll have to face. Like the new sidewalk data, we work in the linear referencing system, which essentially is just a way to understand, it stacks all of our data to the highway center line. So you can have a table that says there's 4 lanes, there's 35-mile-per-hour speed limit, and there's sidewalks on both sides. And it's tied to the road center line because we are a very highway-focused organization right now. And how will this new sidewalk data that is not in the linear referencing system integrate with that? We also work in the Esri GIS world, which is a very particular world, and all of our GIS analysts are accustomed to working in the Esri world, and this data is currently not in that world. So how do we, get people to use it when it's not maybe in the same data pipeline that they're used to? And then also that sort of relates to pulling new data in and sharing our updates out. We need to be able to have our data systems talk with the OS Connect data systems. But again, I'm not terrible. I think these are easier because we have a great technical team to work with. The more difficult problems to work through, which we just wrapped up our interviews, and so we have no answers to these questions yet. We're still formulating, still thinking. But how do we standardize the processes that aren't always centralized? We have 6 regions at WashDOT, and each region operates a little bit differently. Their project engineers operate a little bit differently. And we want to know, as a project is built, that it was completed, and we need to add that data to the sidewalk network. But how do we operate when everyone works a little bit differently? How do we add work? We know we're in a budget situation in the state, and we're in a hiring freeze at WashDOT, and how are we adding work to people's day-to-day responsibilities when we are probably not getting any additional funding for those additional responsibilities? So how can we strategically put steps into the existing workflows to get the data out that we want while not making it feel like a burden to the people who are providing that really useful data to us? And then also, how can we be a good partner and a good encourager to other jurisdictions? We operate state highways, but that's just a small fraction of the road network in the state. And so how do we set a good example for our stewardship practices that encourage local jurisdictions to also do the same with their road or sidewalk data? So those are all big questions that we are very much grappling with and will be for the coming years. But that's where we are at now. And I guess this is Mary and I's contact, but I think now we'll just open it up for Q&A for the whole panel. Yeah.
Thanks, Ray. Hey, Joe Kunzler here. Just a couple of questions. The number one is, how do I request a sidewalk? I called up, this is outlined for Coopville on my Instagram. I have to get off from the bus and walk about a half mile down a dangerous highway with trucks, semi-trucks, and buses, vans, and yes, personal vehicles barreling down it. And I have to make that walk about, the path is about between my 2 hands. I'd like to request a sidewalk, please, for that, because a lot of people come and watch the Jets or a bus stop or something for safety, because it is a risk. The other alternative is to trespass on the Navy's property, and the Navy doesn't like it when overly attached autistic photographers show up. Here's the second question. Have you ever, when you are concerned about your workload, have you ever thought about simply saying, no, we're not going to expand this highway. We're not going to build more, we're not going to expand I-5 or whatever highway in the middle of nowhere. We're going to we're going to move people, not cars. I know it's a heavy lift, but I got to ask the question, so thanks.
Thankfully, do not work on expanding I-5. So there are people, working across the agency who we are trying to do the best that we can with the resources that we have. That transit experience that you have sounds harrowing, and I am sorry that is your experience. I personally don't actually know what the process for requesting a sidewalk is. Do either of you?
I can give a shot at speaking to that a little bit. I think that community engagement and hearing experiences like that is really valuable to WashDOT, but I'm not sure of an existing mechanism to make that happen outside of an already planned project. If there's a project, and unfortunately, I think a lot of the times it is tied to the roadway. If we notice a problem with the roadway, it needs to be repaved, the pavement is deteriorating, then we would come in and do a project there and seek community input on what people would like to see from the project, and that would include things like adding sidewalks to that segment. I wish there was an easier way for that type of engagement and input to happen outside of a previously planned paving project. And maybe there are ways that exist, and we should all probably be more aware of that. And I appreciate the question.
Just one more thing to add. I know each region has an active transportation coordinator. That could be a good resource to reach out to let your needs be known.
I'll send you an email.
Thank you.
Jen Mayer, King County Metro. First of all, thank you. This is a wonderful effort, and this data is great. I partnered with WashDOT about a year or two ago on some sidewalk along SR 900. And I wanted to note a couple things about that. One is when we built the sidewalk, a lot of the cost wasn't so much building the sidewalk, but the stormwater infrastructure that wasn't there. And to whatever degree you can build in the capability, I know you just built this, and now I'm asking you to more, like people are never satisfied when you do data, but if you have any ability to link in to show me what the stormwater is there, because that will also figure into not so much the actual construction, but what the cost is. Well, both really. And the second thing is, since I'm not from WashDOT, I can say this, I think. I think the complete states requires us to complete all the sidewalks in Washington before we can do any more interstate. So that's my interpretation. But I know that might not be a popular one. So.
Yes, okay, great. Thanks for your question. I will speak to your first part first. About integrating stormwater when these projects are being designed. Ideally, that's something that is caught in the scoping phase, and we have projects. There's a SYNC, I think is the acronym, a coordination between all agencies within WashDOT or divisions within WashDOT, but then also working with Department of Commerce and other state partners that are. It's trying to help agencies speak to each other and recognize when they're working on projects in the same place and say, okay, we're planning to build something here in 2025, but you're planning to build something here in 2026. Why would we rip out the road twice after we've just built it? So there are definitely efforts to coordinate between agencies like that. And I think that really goes to communication in the agency before projects are getting built that we're hoping to facilitate at the scoping level so that we avoid problems like that in the future.
Hi, Diane Bennett with King County Metro. I guess we're well represented here. I'm curious, the Open Sidewalks Initiative and the data sharing that you're talking about, has there been conversations about using that to help standardize the policy and process around maintaining these data sets across the multiple agencies? Because I feel like we work with a lot of this type of data, and there are jurisdictions that are pretty advanced in developing and requiring those deliverables at the end of construction projects so that their data sets are maintained. And it seems like if we started to coordinate our efforts around that, the people who are doing that work for us could just know what they have to deliver. And it's the same whether you're doing a WashDOT project, a City of Seattle project, a Metro project. And I'd love to leverage some of the momentum or process that happened in this data collection towards process and policy or contracting specifications, right? So that you're not going, okay, now we're going to develop these standards. You're going, oh, I think SDOT's already done most of this. I'm just going to take theirs and use it. Is there that kind of coordination happening through these types of projects?
Again, for our friends online, you asked the right question and you come from the right institution from which to ask that question. So sitting in this very room was the very first person who envisioned this in 2017 and made an effort to have at least the operational part of MV the operational part of King County Metro Access require that any data collection that was done through the pathway review team be collected in a standardized way. Matthew, would you like to talk about that?
I'm sure, yeah. So I think King County Metro's Access, I'll stand up. King County Metro's Access Paratransit program has implemented this data standard in the data we collect. We're currently working with Nick Abel We're currently working with Nick Abel and Anat's crew in order to extend upon the work we've already done. And there's a small working group at Metro to try to coordinate various sections like our facilities group, our commute trip reduction group, our access to transit group, our access paratransit group, in order to work from a standard data set and a standard set of rules so that information that's collected by one part of the organization immediately becomes available and accessible to all the other parts of the organization that rely upon that type of data set. So we're at the beginning still. Again, we started small, and now we're trying to standardize throughout the agency as to how we work with this type of data set.
So that's part one of the answer. Part two is that the King County innovation team has just partnered with us until 2026 in order to operationalize how this is done on the ground when people do make changes or some kind of impact project, how that gets acquired back into the data. And specifically, they've asked for an app that was kind of mentioned in passing, but I'll talk about it a little bit more now. The data set OS Connect is currently in the transportation data equity infrastructure, which we've put up. But we've also made tools available to be able to access that data and add to it and edit it in various different ways. So if we're talking about multi-stakeholder open data sharing, we want to ensure that everybody can meet the editing requirements and we can meet them at their skill level. Understanding that when Joe wants to put in his concerns about that very narrow data set, that Joe doesn't need to know Esri ArcGIS, but is able to use a mobile application to just enter that specific concern, and it gets to the same data set as does, someone with, entire data set access via Esri or QGIS or whatever is your flavored GIS tooling out there. And so I think that part of it, building the tech stack in order to make more seamless these socio-technical questions that you're asking is a super important part of this, even though, as it seems, when a state makes the demand on us to say, collect the data and make it distributable and available, it doesn't necessarily say upfront, like, develop that tech stack to support these multi-stakeholders to share and continue and maintain that data. But we see it as part of our charge, and it's amazing that we've managed to find you as partners to continue that effort, because it won't necessarily be sustained by, the proviso as it is. Did you want to add?
Covered a lot of it, but I'll just kind of say, there's a great power in working off of the same list. And that's kind of what we're building here, is the ability to have that shared infrastructure. I'd encourage you to reach out to myself at the Public Transportation Division. I'm in the planning group, and we're about to start up the advisory groups for the Public Transportation Plan, and it would be great to have those voices kind of contributing and encouraging us to continue to coordinate with the transit agencies, counties, and cities around the state to sync up those lists and buy into the idea that we need to be using a shared resource so we can have that type of coordination.
Just a quick question. Is it still the case that in most jurisdictions in Washington, the responsibility for the sidewalk lies with the adjacent property owner?
My understanding is yes, don't quote me.
And so we have like this fundamental barrier in actually getting stuff done, because it depends on the person who maybe would rather fix their roof before building a sidewalk in front of their house. So I think we need to sort of, figure out how do we unlock that. Denver recently passed a referendum where they passed funding to build sidewalks and also made sidewalks part of the infrastructure that the city is responsible for. And, you know, when I heard folks talk about that, it said that, well, at the rate at which we were going to fix sidewalks, which was a process that I think Mary or Grace just described, we need to fix the roadway, therefore we're going to address the missing sidewalk. It would have taken 117 years to build the missing sidewalks in Denver. Now they're going to do it in 12. So I think that we really need to, you know, we would never address other parts of critical infrastructure in the way that we deal with sidewalks. We'd say, hey, Ricardo, you know, you'll get power when your neighbor decides to put a freaking pole in front of his house, right? We wouldn't do that. And so I think what's important about this work is for us to say what a fundamental piece of the overall transportation network sidewalks are, and step up and start treating it in that way, and not wait until the roadway fails and then Joe gets his sidewalk.
Yeah. You bring up some really good points, and I encourage you to make those points in a lot of different venues and encourage others to make them as well. The analysis that I showed earlier of 7% of jobs access for a non-driver versus a transit rider, I'll say that was done without the use of sidewalk data, because we didn't have that data set available on a statewide basis when we ran that analysis. And so one of our assumptions in that analysis was that those non-drivers were willing to walk down the center line of a roadway. That would be lower than 7% if we did not make that assumption, much lower than 7%. And one of the future analyses that you'll see out of the Public Transportation Division over the coming months, now that we do have this data, is what's the delta between a person who's willing to walk down the center of a roadway and a person who requires or wants there to be a sidewalk, where there needs to be a curb cut. That 7% number is going to go downwards. And, you know, my hope is that in presenting that type of data and demonstrating the clear gaps that affect people statewide with the lack of sidewalks, that will help to support those conversations that you bring up in the centrality of sidewalks to the transportation network. So that's one way that we hope to contribute.
And just one thing I'll add that made me think when Thomas was speaking, I previously mentioned level of traffic stress, and you know how a 4-foot sidewalk next to Aurora Avenue maybe doesn't feel very comfortable. And I would love to work with the Public Transportation Division on these access metrics to say, okay, yeah, maybe there's a sidewalk there, but it's not very pleasant to use. And do we want to count that as full access? So, you know, combining those sort of metrics to look at a bigger picture rather than just saying, yes, there's sidewalk or no, there's not, and actually speak more to the user experience as you're getting to your transit stop.
So I have a follow-up question about the adjacent sidewalk thing. First off, thank you for a great presentation. But I live in West Hill, Kent, and a few years ago, the sidewalks were pretty bad along the 183 bus, which is kind of like the main bus line around there that goes straight to Kent Station. They recently had a big project where they built like multiple roundabouts and fixed up the sidewalks. And there's one person who like lives right in the middle of the construction, and it looks like they got, you know, a pretty nice new sidewalk, like driveway that connects to the sidewalk. And I remember when construction was going on, like they even like kind of gave this person like their own little detour to get into their house, which was pretty cool. I doubt that they paid for that themselves. So like, do you know if, you know, is doing things like that for people who already live in construction zones, like is that just something that, you know, can be standardized, or is it just up to like the individual project? Because I feel like, you know, getting a new driveway is a pretty sweet deal.
That is a great deal. I don't know the specifics, and I can't speak for WashDOT projects. I can just speak from my general understanding, which is I do think it is a best practice to provide access routes to the homeowners who are adjacent to construction. I believe that is within the responsibilities of the agency who's doing the construction. And I don't know the specifics of, yes, they get an upgraded driveway at the end of this, but also their life is disrupted by having to use a detour during the construction. I totally agree that access to anyone's house should be maintained during construction, and I believe that is a practice, but I can't speak for WashDOT, and I don't exactly know how other cities do it. So.
Thank you.
I wanted to raise the question of time. We've talked just like if you have a sidewalk or a road, that's always there unless there's construction, anyone can use it. However, that is obviously not true for public transit. I serve on the Governor's Committee for Disability Issues and Employment, and I happen to live in Kitsap County, which is a curious sort of place because it's kind of suburban, and they're also rural areas. And what we've realized is that I suspect the barriers to transportation are even greater than what you suggest because a lot of entry-level jobs are not 9 to 5. And if you can't get transportation during the non-commuter hours, you are screwed. It can also affect your ability to accept a promotion. So this is an issue that disproportionately impacts people with disabilities. Thanks.
You're 100% correct. And I will say another assumption that is not at all reasonable, but was required by the time frame that we had to perform that particular analysis, was that those trips were happening between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. on a weekday. Guess what? Transit is not as good outside of that time frame as it is in that time frame. So, likewise with using the sidewalk data, and it would be awesome to have you consider participating in the community advisory group for the public transportation plan, or seeing if there's a way to coordinate. But we will be looking at broadening that analysis in many ways, including, for example, looking at weekday, overnight access and the difference in access that is available at different times for sure, as well as many other factors. So you're spot on.
Of the funding for specialized community-led impact opportunities. And so we had Lacey Hampton join us because she's part of this first cycle. This was an opportunity for different community-led efforts to do a deeper dive collection. So basically, in Lacey's case, interest in better understanding the connectivity between sidewalks and the parks, and what is the park infrastructure that's available for footpaths and pedestrians. And so enabling that interaction with the data, both being able to vet it, but also add specifically the types of attributes that you might be elevating with this particular project of access, enables people to maybe do like a deeper dive pilot type of study to better understand where shall we take this data moving forward, what are other use cases that we may not have considered earlier. So stay tuned for our next round of SCLEOs. And what I put on the screen at the same time is also the extent of where the data is right now. So you get an opportunity to kind of view it. I mentioned that there's a dashboard. There's both a dashboard that tracks the number of sidewalk and curb and crossing elements that are available, but also a place where you can go look at the data and be able to comment on it. The link is simply viewer.tdei.us, and you can get in there. There's no log-on requirement or anything like that. If you want to actually download data sets, you can register with the TDEI to be able to download these at your leisure. Any other questions?
I just want to quickly give some feedback about my insights. I feel like even with the understanding over here as a resident who gonna be like, live here and then later on have family, this issue is actually more complicated and more important than we think. Thinking about the housing cost is like so expensive right now. A lot of the young people might right now live a small apartment, and later on when they want to raise up a family, they might still in a very urban setting. And with the kids that they have to raise them up, to my own experience, it relies on a lot of the city or the state effort. And I'm hoping that in the future, it will not just be the sidewalk itself, not just about this, but thinking about how the generation currently would need a lifestyle that's urban setting, but still like safe and then pleasant for the kids, and then those like walking distance to the schools or meeting your friends. It's actually quite hard here because the original design is not like that. And it would be even sadder that when we want to give our kids a better neighborhood, that we have to even spend more to just move to the suburban area. And so I would just give a lot of examples, but one would be like many, many years ago that we settled down, we got a house, but the bus line was taken away, and then we have very limited choices to be able to use the bus system to like compared to what we can do before. And then later on when I got pregnant, I got 2 kids, I have to do like a double stroller, everything just become really unmanageable. So I'm hoping that this conversation will not just be limited to us over here, but thinking about those, like, you just never think that, oh, suddenly I'm a mom. And even though I'm myself as a professional, it gets so unbelievable complicated, and then just like, I become someone always rely on another person to help me out because I have 2 kids and it's always double stroller. And without it's supposed to have a really nice bus system that allowed me to do that, but I couldn't. I have to get another car. And then later on, I decided to move outside my original neighborhood, even I still love it. And so I'm hoping the conversation could, be pushing to the current generation, and who gonna maybe, because of the cost of the living, they would have to really think about this and then have the voice to be heard.
So I don't know if you have a response to that. I think, the painstaking efforts that folks who are non-drivers have to go through in our urban environments are definitely getting more and more concentrated efforts out there to both understand what those concerns are and then elevate those voices, because really the data reflects the lived experience of people who have been potentially marginalized from transportation access and access to different community settings. What I find is that there are lots of siloed efforts to better understand those things. So Disability Rights Washington did a really in-depth ethnographic effort several years ago to understand some of these lived experiences in the community. Then I see, what Arman was talking about, also elevating the voices who are most impacted by these projects. Seattle DOT has a pedestrian accessibility action coalition, and those are folks who meet on a regular basis to specifically address the concerns in a particular jurisdiction. But, the thing that I really wanted to talk about tomorrow, and hopefully we can chat about these in the room, is how do we bring everyone together, sort of to speak to the question that was asked earlier, so that we can put our efforts in concert, at least working in ways that are aware of other efforts that are happening, because I see a lot of intent out there, and especially now as I project that the next 4 years are going to require us to be regionally owning these efforts. We may not have the federal support that we've had up until now. It's really important to understand who are the actors that can assist and put the efforts forward. And really, at the end of the day, it's efforts of people, right? Like, if Matthew Widener didn't make that effort to make open sidewalks a data schema for King County Metro Access, I would not be standing here in front of you right now. And I owe that to Matthew. But there were a few other actors along the way that also kind of propelled things along. So we are all responsible for that kind of understanding, both what Thomas was talking about how data really drives a concerted operationalizing of the kinds of legislative efforts that we've put forward, but also in terms of, machinating and pushing these things along. It's people along the way. It's not necessarily some untold strong force outside of us. And I think the next 4 years will demonstrate how well we need to perform and hold strong to these efforts. And I think with that, I should let you have some lunch. Thank you so much for joining us today.